Welcome. My name is Guido Friebel. I'm moderating today's talk in a new series. We had the last one, the first one last week, and I think it was very interesting. It's about industrial policy, and I'd like to thank very much CEPR and EBRD to organize this. Dominick Bartelme is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan and is mainly interested in trade and economic geography. And we're very much looking forward to your paper on the textbook case for industrial policy and how theory may or may not meet the data. Thank you very much. Dominick, take it away.
Thank you, Guido. And thank you everyone for being here. So this is joint work with Arnaud Cosino, Dave Donaldson, and Andres Rodriguez-Clare. And we're in the middle right now of revising this paper. So, your comments are very much welcome. There's still a window of time to influence the final form. So let me see here. There we go. Okay. So as we heard last time from the introductory remarks, and as you all know, there's renewed interest in industrial policy. And industrial policy means a lot of things. There's many forms, new, like a new form that Noam was talking about last week, and old. So this is not a paper about everything you need to know about industrial policy. This is a paper about the textbook case for industrial policy, and the innovation that we're bringing, I think, the main innovation is that we're confronting this textbook case with the data and doing a quantitative analysis. So what is this textbook case for industrial policy? At least as we understand it, it goes something like this. Here we have a graphical representation of an industry. We've got this demand curve D sloping downward. And we've got, here the privately perceived marginal cost. I'm not showing you the curve, but I'm showing you a couple of different points on the curve here. Here's at output Q, and here's at output Q star. This is the marginal cost curve that private agents in the economy perceive. And it's different than the social marginal cost curve, right? Which is this downward sloping thing here. And so the market by itself is going to produce at point Q, where this private marginal cost curve intersects with the demand curve. But that's not optimal. The planner or the government can induce a better allocation by providing a subsidy S that's equal to the gap between the privately perceived marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve at point Q star to induce the economy to produce at point Q star. And the gains from this are going to be the area of the gray triangle. Okay, so this is a textbook case for industrial policy, providing subsidies to an industry to align private and social incentives. Okay. So this is, I think a case that goes back to, John Stuart Mill and Frank Graham's argument for protection. And, we have models that are basically combine a Ricardian view of trade based on technology differences with external economies of scale that give rise to these gaps between private and social returns. And the issue with these models, they're very instructive, they make the theoretical points nicely, but when you go to the data, there's some issues. One is that there tends to be multiple equilibria. The point in this model is that you can get stuck at a bad equilibrium, potentially with specialization against your comparative advantage, leading to potentially losses from trade for some countries. And in these models, what you want to do is you want to have industrial policy that pushes you, into the better equilibrium. But models with multiplicity, especially of this type and with lots of corners, are really difficult to test or quantify. And hence, to our knowledge, there hasn't really been many attempts. Okay, so we're going to take this classic combination of Ricardian trade and external economies of scale, and we're going to add gravity international demand system in a way that I'll explain hopefully more thoroughly in a few slides. But what gravity is going to give us, what adding some curvature to international demand is going to give us, is that we're going to have a unique equilibrium. We're going to have a well-defined optimal trade policy where optimal industrial policy rather, that is going to be given by a simple Pigouvian tax formula. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to propose this approach to quantifying the gains, and then we're going to estimate the external economies of scale and do the quantification. And I'm putting it in this way for this presentation. I'll be living in a gravity world, but you can see the paper for more general international demand systems. I just want to mention that this is not reliant in theory on the gravity international demand system, but is a more general approach. But we're using gravity, and for the purposes of this presentation, that's where we'll stay. All right. So let me jump into the theoretical framework. Okay, we're in a world with many countries indexed by I and J, and a number of sectors indexed by K. To start, let's think of the case with one factor of production, labor. Okay, so we have linear production functions, and here's the gravity piece. We're going to have constant elasticity of substitution, import demand. That is this little X IJK, which is the import share of country J from country I. This object here is going to be given by the following system, right? It's going to depend on the costs of production and shipment from country I to country J in sector K, raised to the power of the trade elasticity, and then the price index in country J. So here we have this, we'll model this cost as a production cost that has the wage in country I and the productivity, and depends negatively on the productivity of country I in sector K. And then we have a bilateral component, which is an iceberg trade cost from going from country I to country J in sector K. And the price index is just a classic CES formula. Okay. So this is a standard setting. You can get it from an Armington model with multiple sectors, or an Eaton-Corda model with multiple sectors. And in the sort of vanilla Armington or Eaton-Corda framework, this cost function is just going to be this guy here, right? The wage, productivity, which is exogenous, and an exogenous bilateral shifter, the tau. Instead of that, we're going to introduce this very small innovation here. We're going to make the cost partially endogenous, and we're going to make it endogenous to the scale of the sector in the exporting country. Okay, so the larger the sector is, if gamma is a positive number, the lower the cost of production are, and then hence the higher the sales. Now, importantly, we're assuming that firms and consumers are going to take the size of the sector K as given. Okay, these are external and not internal increasing returns. And so this is precisely the feature that firms and consumers take L as given, but in reality, it's determined jointly by all their decisions that's going to give rise to the gap between private and social returns that industrial policy is going to address. Okay. As an aside, for equilibrium to be unique in this type of model, the external returns cannot be too large. In fact, they have to be less than or equal to 1 over the trade elasticity. And so minor point, we'll see that that's going to be satisfied by our estimates, so we won't have to worry about that. Okay. So what does optimal policy look like in this framework? Well, we'll take the perspective of a government in country I that cares only about the welfare of its own people, and their objective is to maximize that welfare of the representative agent in their country. And the tools that they're going to have at their disposal are going to be trade taxes or subsidies, so import tariffs, export taxes, and production taxes or subsidies that apply to the production of both, domestic and foreign or goods for export and for domestic consumption. And in this environment, the optimal industrial policy is extremely simple. It's completely characterized by the Pigouvian motive to internalize externalities, and it's simply given by production subsidies S that are equal to gamma K. That is the elasticity of productivity with respect to sector size. Okay. Optimal trade policy in this context is going to be characterized by terms of trade motivations. You're going to want to restrict your sales to other countries, since you are the monopoly supplier of your own variety of good in this Armington EK type framework. And if the country is small in the rest of the world and can't affect relative prices, then the export taxes are going to take a particularly simple form. They're just going to be given by 1 over 1 plus the trade elasticity. So standard formula. The lower the trade elasticity, the less elastic demand for your good, the more you want to restrict output. If the country is not small, this formula, well, we no longer have a formula. The motivations get more complicated, or the motivation stays the same rather, but the implementation becomes much more complicated. But we think this is the formula that we're going to take to the data. We think, most countries are small. This is going to be a reasonable approximation. Okay, so this is the model. Very simple. This is the policy. Now, what are we going to do with it? How do we get to estimation and quantification? So it's going to be a few easy steps. The first step is that we're going to, should say, one must estimate demand, okay? And estimating demand in our context, demand is going to be completely characterized by the data up to trade elasticity theta. So that's the parameter that we need to know the international demand system. Once we know that international demand system, we're going to invert demand to infer the prices that rationalize the trade flows that we see in the data. We see trade flows, we don't see prices, but given the demand system, we can invert those trade flows to recover what the prices must have been to give rise to the trade flows that we see. So that's what we'll do. So we'll recover an estimate, a model-based estimate of prices of output in each for each exporter. And then in the third step, we're going to regress prices on industry size to estimate the external economies of scale parameters, the gammas. And we'll talk more about that. And then once we have these two parameters, theta and gamma, we're going to use the estimated model to quantify the gains from optimal policy, both trade and industrial policy, although our focus will be on the industrial policy. All right, and we'll go through each of these steps in turn.
I just sent a message to everybody in the chat that maybe if there are questions about the setting, this would be the right moment, but I haven't seen any, so please go ahead. Excellent.
I'm glad it's clear enough so far. or people are totally lost, one or the other. We'll pretend that it's totally clear. Okay, so we're going through these steps. Step one, estimate demand. This is how we would do it. We start from this assumed demand system, right, where the share of exports from of J's imports coming from I in sector K are given by this formula here with this cost function CIJK. And we just take logs of this formula. We get this expression here. And assuming that this trade taxes, this iceberg shifter, can be written in the following form, that it's the product of an IJK term that is, observable, like a tariff or ad valorem tariff or something like that, and an unobservable term epsilon IJK. We can write this expression here in the following form, which should be familiar to you, right? The log of the trade share is going to be given by an origin effect, an IK origin effect, a destination effect, an observable bilateral term, that's a trade shifter, like a tariff, again, that has the coefficient theta in front of it, and an unobserved bilateral error term. And then if one had access to tariff data, right, this is a regression, here's data, here are some dummy variables that one can use fixed effects to get rid of, and we look at how differences in tariffs correlate with differences in trade shares to get an estimate of theta. So this is a standard approach in the gravity literature. We don't have anything to add to it. And so we're actually ourselves not estimating these parameters. We're bringing results from the literature. We do a very small kind of meta-analysis and take the median of the estimates. And we explore robustness to different values. Okay, so this would be the strategy. All of the parameters that we use are estimated with some version of this strategy, and we bring in the results from the literature. So with these results, then we know what the thetas are, what the curvature of international demand for each product is. Okay. Then with the thetas in hand, we can go back to our formula. And now we see that, this expression for the trade shares with the thetas can be inverted to get an expression for the cost function. And in this sense, right, if you ignore the price index, right, we see that this term, the trade share to the -1 over theta, is some sense a trade revealed inverse measure of productivity, right? If you have, the trade flows themselves, once you know the international demand system, reveal how productive or how low the costs in different countries are going to be. So this is what I mean by inverting demand, that is taking the trade flows and the demand system to reveal prices or productivity, the inverse. Okay.
So Dominick,
yes.
Permit me to briefly interrupt for two questions, which I think are still conceptual somehow. The first one was by Sound Ray, who asked whether your model would be applicable also for the infant industry case, or would you consider that this is really a story about mature industries?
That's a great question. I guess it depends a little bit on what you mean by infant industry, but in this model, there are certainly no zeros. You're not going to have a setting in which an industry just doesn't exist and some sort of industrial policy is going to bring it into being. So I would say that this is not a great model of at least how I understand infant industries. Yeah, great question.
Thanks much. And Louise Guilloyer asks, when you do step 1, don't you observe prices?
No. not directly. I'll talk a little bit about the data that we use, but basically, we use standard macroeconomic data on trade flows, but not, at a level of aggregation where, unit values or any sort of price information is completely, that you might find in the data is completely meaningless. And so, no, we're going to use the model to recover what the theory consistent prices, price indices rather, must have been.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we know the international demand system. We have a measure of productivity or cost for each sector country combination that's revealed by the trade flows combined with the demand system. Now we get to the really interesting part, which is to estimate this external economies of scale parameter. Okay, so just to remind you, we have this trade revealed measure of productivity, right? After we strip out the influence of the importer price index. And according to our theory, it's going to be equal to wage, an exogenous productivity term, this endogenous productivity term, and then this bilateral shifter, which is also exogenous. Okay, we can rearrange and take logs to get the following structural expression here, where on the left-hand side we have this trade share that's being deflated by the trade elasticity, and then on the right-hand side we have all the components, which we can write in the following form: the log of the trade share times 1 over the trade elasticity equals this destination sector fixed effect. Okay, that's capturing the price index. A bilateral shifter, that's origin destination specific, but not sector specific. This scale, so this is going to soak up any origin bilateral but not sector specific element of the tau here. And it's also going to soak up any common element of the origin or destination countries that's common across sectors. So for example, the wage is going to be captured by this origin destination specific fixed term. And we have any other bilateral shifters in this error term eta. And what we're left with is the thing that we want to know about, which is the sector size, LIK, the labor input, and that's multiplied by the scale elasticity. And so the basic idea is to regress the trade flows that we see on some fixed effects and the size of the sector to infer the elasticity of revealed productivity on with respect to the size of the sector. Okay, so this is the regression that we want to run. Of course, we have an identification issue, which is the following. Over here in this error term, we have the AIK, that is the exogenous piece of productivity in the sector. Of course, a sector that is, just exogenously more productive will tend to, both export more, that's in the formula, but it will also tend to be larger. Okay, and so there's a structural correlation between the error term, the unobserved piece of productivity, and the size of the sector, which is, the postulated source of productivity, the endogenous portion of productivity improvements. So what do we need? We need something that shifts the size of the sector that's uncorrelated with productivity, or, in trade terms, the comparative advantage of that country sector. So we need a demand side IV, which we'll call ZK, that shifts the size of the sector. And the basic idea here is going to be to use domestic demand shocks as that instrument. And it has some similarities to some work that's looked at home market effects, right? How domestic demand affects exports. Here, it's subtly different. We're looking at how domestic demand shifts sector size and then shifts, and then how sector size shifts the trade revealed productivity. But there's a family resemblance between these procedures. So what are we going to use for domestic demand shocks? We're going to take a structural approach. And the idea is as follows. Suppose that the domestic demand for different sectors, right, the aggregator of different sectoral outputs in textiles, machinery, et cetera, were Cobb-Douglas. Then we would use just simply the observed consumption shares, which are the EJK, we'll call this, scaled up by the size of the country as a whole to predict the size of each sector in absolute terms, right? Countries that have a higher expenditure share on a good, they just happen to have a taste for it, would, all else equal, be expected to have larger industries, but in a way that wouldn't necessarily be correlated with their productivity in those industries. And that would be the identifying restriction. We generalize this procedure to constant elasticity of substitution. And I won't have time to talk about the details, but we estimate a row instead of 1 in the Cobb-Douglas case of 1.5 roughly. And then we use a slightly more sophisticated equivalent of this procedure of just using the expenditure shares. We use the residuals from the CES demand system multiplied by the size of the country as the IV. That's the basic idea. What do we need for this procedure to work? We need that domestic demand shocks, that is the residuals of the CES demand system, are going to be uncorrelated with domestic supply shocks, essentially, the AIK, right? And if that's the case, then this procedure will consistently recover the scale elasticities gamma. All right. We're going to be.
I just interrupt
Yes.
before you go to the data, because there was one more question about the setting and the assumptions, and that is by Kalina Manova, who asks, what if the composite input factor and its associated cost, labor, and wage year vary across sectors?
We will. So in our baseline case, we're assuming that they're not. We discuss in the paper and do some robustness checks where they do, right? Where we add sort of hex rolling forces. So we have labor and capital with used in different proportions in different sectors. And we also add intermediate goods in a way that makes that input bundle vary across sectors. And so we can handle that. The result is not so different for reasons that I can explain it at more length later, but yeah, we do some of that, and the results seem pretty robust. For now, we'll do the simple version. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so the data, we use the OECD inter-country input-output tables with 61 countries and 34 sectors. We're going to focus on the 15 manufacturing sectors. And we're going to use the data years 1995, 2000, 2005, and 2010. I should say that the estimation is essentially cross-sectional. You don't see any T's subscripts on what I showed you. And we could do and have done the estimation for 1 year alone. We get a little bit of extra power, tiny bit of extra power from using the extra years. But again, we're not really using the time series so much as just a repeated cross-section. And finally, we get population data from the Penn World Tables. Okay, the moment you've been waiting for. These are the estimates. Here we have, forget about columns 3 through 5, and let's focus on columns 1 and 2. Here in column 1, we have the OLS estimates, and this is part 1 of the table. And here we have the IV estimates. And so scale elasticities are, non-zero, okay, tend to be bounded away from zero with a 95% confidence interval. They're ranging from 7%, so a doubling of sector size leads to a 7% increase in productivity for coke and petroleum products, up to 25% for rubber and plastic, 20% for chemicals, etc. So there is a range. They're generally positive, but there's a range. I want to point out that, consistent with our theory of what might be going on econometrically, OLS estimates are universally higher than the IV estimates, although the bias is not enormous. Okay, and here are the rest of the sectors. Similar pattern that we see here, a range of scale elasticities with OLS generally higher than the IV. And so and again, you know, in no manufacturing sector do we see zero scale elasticity. So this is a pervasive feature of the manufacturing data using this approach, and there is some substantial variation across sectors. And I should say that, you know, other people in different contexts have estimated these external returns, and they're, you know, I think we're roughly not radically different from what other people have found with different approaches. Okay, so and can you tell me how much time do I have? Do I have 10 more minutes?
You can have 10 to max 15, so we still have some time to discuss. Okay.
Okay, I will try to limit it. Okay, so we're on step 4. We have our estimates, we have the scale elasticities, we have the trade elasticities. It's time to quantify the gains. And for our quantification, we're going to assume a small open economy. We're going to assume the data is generated by a laissez-faire, no policy equilibrium. We're going to assume that the elasticity of substitution between services and manufacturing is also equal to 1.5. We're going to assume at the baseline no scale economies in non-manufacturing. You'll see that this sort of will tend to amplify the gains. We'll show you what if there are scale economies in non-manufacturing. And we're going to define the gains from industrial policy as follows. We're going to say the gains from industrial policy are going to equal the gains from going to the fully optimal policy less the gains from using trade policy alone. Right? So imagine that the policymaker doesn't know that there are scale economies. They're living in a country that has external economies of scale. They're doing the optimal trade policy, and then they come along, they read our paper, and they say, oh, wow, I could do better, and they implement the optimal industrial policies. That's going to be what we define as the gains. There are other ways, but that's what we'll do for now. So here are the gains. And let me go through this table. This is the main table in detail. So here in column 1, we have the gains from implementing both optimal trade and industrial policy. And we have some representative countries, and then down here are the averages, both weighted and GDP weighted. So we see that the gains are ranging from, you know, about 2.5% down to about 0.5%, with an average of, you know, around 1%, depending on how you count. Now, if you only do industrial policy, right, you don't do trade policy at all, the gains are much smaller. In fact, they can even be negative, like for Ireland. Why is that? Well, if you do implement the Pigouvian subsidies without implementing the optimal trade taxes, you will succeed in increasing your productivity and also driving down your terms of trade. And sometimes the terms of trade losses from doing that can be so large as to swamp any productivity gains, although that's not the normal case. From doing trade policy only, you get the gains in column 3. They tend to be higher than the gains from doing industrial policy only. And then what we'll call the gains from trade policy are this column here, optimal policy, less industrial policy only. And we'll call column 5 the gains from industrial policy, optimal policy, column 1, minus column 3, the gains from doing trade policy only. And as we see, the gains from industrial policies, we define them, are around 0.5% of initial GDP with some variation. So despite the fact that we have, significant external economies of scale, ranging from 7 to 25% per doubling of employment, the gains are not transformative. So let's understand where these gains come from. Let me remind you of this picture here. The gains from this type of policy are given by the area of this triangle, and you can show that the area of this triangle is around the optimum, approximated by the following formula, which is kind of a generalized base times height calculation. Here's the formula, and you can see that the gains reflect the size of the subsidies, the gamma, and the quantity response to the subsidies, which is given by this term, the labor share in sector K times this term here, which I'll explain more in a second. And using this sort of crude formula to approximate the magnitude of gains, we get, and using averages, so average labor shares in manufacturing, average scale economy, et cetera, we get roughly 0.4%, which is pretty close to what we see. So what's the intuition here? The way I like to think about it is as follows. In a closed economy, the gains are limited by domestic demand. As we take rho, the elasticity of substitution across sectors, to be larger and larger, the gains can get arbitrarily large, but it goes the other way too. As we make it smaller and smaller, the gains are really limited by how much of each good you actually want to absorb, right? In a closed economy, you can't make some sectors super small and others really large to reap the gains because you want to consume a bit of everything. Now, the open economy faces more elastic international demand, and hence the gains tend to be higher for more open countries. One subtle point is that openness in both types of sectors, both high scale elasticity sectors and low scale elasticity sectors, is important, because in order to gain from the more elastic international demand, one also has to be able to import the stuff that you're no longer making, to replace the domestic production with imports. You'll see this is pretty key, because one constraint on the size of the gains is that much of modern economies, up to 70–80% in the service sector, is relatively closed. So that limits your ability to reallocate resources towards the higher scale elasticity sectors. And let me just show you how important openness is. Here we have openness plotted against the gains from industrial policy, and the relationship is very tight. So openness is really the key determinant of the size of the gains, and the key constraint on the size of the gains that countries can enjoy. So let me wrap up relatively quickly. We do some additional policy experiments. We look at what we call constrained industrial policy, which is gains from second best production subsidies when no export taxes are available. You might think of this as, a country that obeys the WTO, or that's in a free trade agreement, or that's decided to bind their tariff levels to low levels, but can use industrial production subsidies instead. And then we also look at globally, what we call globally efficient industrial policy, gains from all countries simultaneously implementing the optimal production subsidies. And we see that, you know, the world as a whole being a closed economy, the average gains from globally efficient policy are on the whole rather small, because the world doesn't want that much more manufacturing, even if we can make it very cheaply. Okay, let me last mention a few robustness things. If you have higher scale economies in non-manufacturing than our baseline, that tends to give you lower gains. So our gains are that we report are an upper bound with respect to that counterfactual. Of course, if you have a higher elasticity of domestic demand, you do get slightly higher gains, but quantitatively not a ton higher. Suppose you have lower trade elasticities, that tends to lead to higher gains, both because it tends to imply that the data tend to imply that you have higher scale elasticities if you assume that you have lower trade elasticities, and because trade policy becomes much more effective. And the big difference from our baseline results comes from adding intermediate goods. And I don't have time to go into details, but adding intermediate goods is going to amplify the gains from industrial policy by somewhere between 2 and 4 times, depending on how exactly you introduce intermediate goods into this model of scale economies. But still, you know, we're talking about maximum 3 to 4% of GDP for the gains on average. Okay, so let me just take 1 minute to conclude. You know, the usual skepticism about the textbook industrial policy is that, well, it sounds great. I'm sure it'd be wonderful to do it, but we don't know, you know, we don't know which are the winners. We don't know the scale elasticities. So here we estimate the scale elasticities in a new way. And we find that, in fact, you know, there's evidence of them with large variability about across sectors, which is a necessary condition for this textbook industrial policy to be effective. Nonetheless, we find that in practice, the gains are not zero, but are maybe smaller than you might have thought. And the key driver of that is basically demand is much less elastic, either because you're not open or because even in an open economy, demand curves tend to slope downwards than the classical cases for industrial policy would suggest. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominick, for a brilliant presentation. Sorry for some perturbances in the background. It's home office, you know. Yes. I have 2 questions by Florian Meneres, and I was just wondering, Florian, whether you may want to ask them yourself. I'm gonna unmute you now. Florian, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Very well, thank you. Please ask your questions.
Yes, thank you, Dominick, for this presentation. So just, yes, 2 questions. So the estimates you obtained for the intensity of external economies of scale, they are quite higher than those obtained by urban economics paper that regress measures of workers or firm level productivity on local employment density in an intranational framework. So here I was just, and so those estimates generally, they are in between 2 to 5% in terms of elasticity. So I was wondering how we should compare those 2 approaches. That was the first question. And the second question was more about, here it seems that in the framework, specialization is neutral in terms of subsequent growth, but there are all these papers a la Rodrigue and Hidalgo showing that specialization might matter for subsequent growth. And so is there any way to introduce considerations like this in the framework here to quantify the gains we can expect from industrial policy?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So in terms of the first question, I agree with your characterization of the urban literature, and I think these are simply different objects. So there's no necessary relation between the productivity gains, economy-wide associated with economy-wide density in a region, and the productivity gains associated with specialization in a particular industry, at the country or even the regional level. I think it would be interesting to estimate these, take this approach at a subnational level, but focusing on specialization on industry level economies of scale. I'm not aware of a lot of work that or any work actually that does that. So I think that would be interesting, and that would be more comparable. In terms of your second question, I agree. There's no growth in this model, and so yeah, I think that's an open question. I think that's fascinating. We don't have anything one way or the other to say about that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. I'll take away your privileges if I can. Yes, I have. Now, I have a question, or maybe two, maybe one remark and one question. A question is about the costs of industrial policy, and your estimates are really very low, while raising taxes is a very expensive thing to do. So one could really wonder for what countries it is even worth the effort to do industrial policy, in particular in a time in which everybody is doing it, as your global estimates are showing. But now, of course, because of the crisis, some countries may find it easier to subsidize their industries than others, and they could reap additional benefits. And I wonder what your opinion is about this point of view.
Yeah, so I agree that the size of these estimates should raise some alerts on the practical on people who are interested in implementing these in practice, because here we assume the costs are zero of doing policy, but as you say, we know that's not true. And so this is the most optimistic case in some sense. And so if this doesn't look big to you under these conditions, then under real world conditions, it would be even less so, I think. Now, the fact that other countries are doing industrial policy, I don't think makes you want to do it less, though. I think it makes you want to do it more, because you may you may lose out. You may have to run harder to stay in the same place. So yes, I mean, it's the gains from everyone doing it aren't huge, but if everyone's doing it and you're not, that may not be good for you either. Although it depends on the country. It depends on the country. Yeah, I guess that's what I'll say.
Thank you very much. So I would like to ask into the round of participants whether there are more questions. One question is coming from Kalina Manova. And Kalina, if that's fine for you, I would unmute you so you can, oh, where are you? You were just here, now you're gone. Let me just see. Oh, here you are, yeah. Kalina, would you like to speak?
Great, well, thanks very much, Dominic. This is really interesting. I thought your results for the role of input-output links across sectors, intermediate inputs, are very interesting. And I guess I have two related questions on that. So one is, to the extent that input-output tables are asymmetric, so input use is not symmetric across sectors, does that in any way complicate the estimation of sector-specific economies of scale? And then a separate question is more conceptual, not so much about estimation. So to the extent that some sectors might have high economies of scale, but not be very important inputs for downstream production, do we need to take both into account when we're choosing which industries to stimulate? So kind of how we think about industrial policy when we have both economies of scale and input-output use varying across sectors.
Great, thank you. Those are good questions. Let me tackle the first one first. So the short answer is yes, it does complicate estimation. Instead of being able to absorb the factor cost term, in some fixed effect across countries, as is the case when there's just the common wage to absorb. Now the input bundle is varying in a somewhat complicated way across sectors, and yeah, if you do nothing, you're going to get biased estimates. What we show in the paper is that if you know what that sector-specific input bundle looks like, that is, how to aggregate appropriately, as you would, for example, if the production function is Cobb-Douglas in the intermediate goods, then you can just read off the factor shares from the data. Then there's a way to control appropriately for the way that the input bundle varies across sectors, so as to achieve consistent estimation. And we do that in the paper. Interestingly, it doesn't make it makes some difference. So there's definitely a difference, but it's not a huge difference from our baseline estimates. And I think that's partly due to two factors. One is a strong diagonal element in input-output tables, and so the own factor costs, the own factor cost is very highly correlated with the input bundle. And the second is that wages vary much more. The common component of costs varies much more across countries than input bundles, which are partly made up of tradable goods. And so it's the non-traded factors like labor or capital that are actually determining most of the variation in the factor cost. So it makes a difference, but not a huge difference. In terms of how intermediates affect optimal policy, it depends a little bit on how you introduce intermediates into the model. So I'm afraid I may not be able to give you a very good explanation in the abstract without showing you some math. But there's definitely some ways that you do it in which the subsidy is the same, regardless of how upstream or downstream the industry is. And it's just the effects of that same subsidy that differ across upstream and downstream industries. There's another way to introduce, that's in some important ways isomorphic, to introduce these scale economies. And in that case, then the subsidy would vary across upstream and downstream industries. So maybe it depends on how you model intermediate goods.
Thank you very much. I have a question by Arthur Ratzivil, and I will unmute him. Arthur?
Hey, great to be here. Great to hear that presentation. So paper shows that the gains from optimal policies are rather low. One worry about industrial policy is to make mistakes, to actually subsidize what shouldn't be subsidized, etc. The question is, do these results imply that the costs of mistakes are relatively low? Because
yes, you're absolutely correct. They do. So that's maybe that is necessarily the flip side of saying that the gains are low, is that the costs of doing it wrong are also low. Low risk, low reward.
So I think one could not find a better way to to summarize the paper.
Maybe we should use that in the introduction. I like that.
I'm not sure it's a great marketing line for your paper, which was very instructive and beautifully presented. Thanks a lot. So what remains to be said is that I'm very grateful for this, and I think we've all benefited a big deal. I should also just maybe do a little bit of publicity for the journal Economics of Transition and Institutional Change. So if any of the people who have listened to have interesting papers on this very topic, industrial policy, potentially also state ownership, these are the kind of things that we talk a lot about currently. I'd be very open also maybe for symposium ideas. So it would be lovely, just contact me by my email. Other than that, I think this was a very nice 60 minutes spent with very nice insights. Thank you very much. And also thanks for the discipline and the interesting questions. So I guess we call it a day. Next week comes the next presentation. We're all looking forward to it. And thank you all very much.